Take my card. I want your mom. Why would I want your mom? Because a mom is worth more than money, and I have all the money. The late afternoon light spilled gold over the public gardens near the harbor, slipping through the plane trees and laying long amber stripes across the gravel path. It was one of those unhurried Saturdays where the whole neighborhood seemed to exhale at once, kids shrieking on the swings, the creak of rusty chains, the far-off murmur of the city traffic softened into background noise. On a faded quilt spread near the edge of the grass sat Nia. 29, dressed in a flour-dusted linen apron she hadn't bothered to take off, her curls pinned loosely with a pencil she'd forgotten was there. She looked unbothered, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, one eye always drifting back toward the sandbox 30 feet away. In that sandbox was her daughter, 11 years old, red shirt, denim dungarees, a smear of wet sand already drying on her cheek. Zendaya wasn't building a sandcastle. She was building an empire, one bucket at a time, narrating the whole construction to nobody in particular like a tiny foreman on a job site only she could see. Then the air around the playground changed. A black car eased to the curb, too clean, too quiet for the neighborhood. The door opened, and a small boy stepped out, 7 years old, in a suit jacket so sharp it looked stitched onto him, dark hair combed with military precision. Behind him, 3 broad-shouldered men in matching black suits fell into place like a wall that had learned to walk. Parents on nearby benches went quiet, phones lowering just slightly. The boy didn't look at the slide. He didn't look at the swings. His eyes went straight to the sandbox and stayed there. He walked over, small shoes crunching gravel, hands folded in front of him like he was approaching a business meeting instead of a 7-year-old's turf. He stopped right at the wooden border and looked down. Zendaya didn't look up right away. She patted a wall of sand into place, blew a curl out of her face, and only then noticed the shiny loafers standing exactly where her supply line was supposed to go. "You're standing in my delivery route," she said, not even bothering to sound polite about it. "I need a mom," the boy said. No warm-up, no hello, just that. Zendaya's shovel stopped mid-scoop. She stood up slowly, brushing sand off her knees, sizing him up the way an older sibling sizes up anyone half a foot shorter. "Excuse me." "My dad has one job," the boy went on, voice small but steady, like he'd rehearsed this in the car. "Keep the company safe. He doesn't have time for the other job, so the house is very big and very quiet and I eat dinner by myself most nights." He reached into his jacket. The guards behind him didn't even flinch like this was routine and pulled out a matte gold card. He held it out to her with both hands, the way you'd offer something sacred. "Take my card. I want your mom." Zendaya stared at the card, then at him. Then over her shoulder at Nia, who was very much not paying attention yet, still stirring her coffee, still blissfully unaware her entire life was about to be renegotiated by 2 children under a slide. "That's not really how moms work," Zendaya said slowly, like she was explaining something to a much younger kid, even though he was only 4 years her junior. "You can't just buy one." "Everything has a price," the boy said, with the flat certainty of someone repeating a phrase he'd heard from an adult far too many times. "My father says it every day." "You don't just buy a mom in a sandbox, kid," Zendaya said, planting her hands on her hips. "That's not how any of this works." "Daddy said everything valuable has a price," he repeated, quieter this time, less like a fact and more like a question he was hoping she'd disprove. Zendaya crossed her arms, weighed the card, weighed him, hollow-eyed, too polished, too alone for a 7-year-old in a public park with an armed escort. Something in her chest, the same something she got when a stray cat looked too thin, tugged sideways. "What's your name?" "Kim Jin-soo." "Well, Jin-soo," she said, snatching the card out of his hand before she could think better of it. "I'm not selling my mom, but I'm currently short one assistant and the job comes with snacks. I'm 4 years older than you, which means I'm the boss of this sandbox and bosses don't work for free either. So here's the deal." She shoved a small plastic bucket into his chest. "You want a big sister, you earn it, fill it, pack it tight. No air pockets or the wall falls down and we start over." Jin-soo looked at the bucket like it had been placed there by a foreign dignitary requiring careful diplomatic handling. Then he looked back at the three men standing at a respectful distance, arms folded, sunglasses on despite the fact that the sun was doing exactly nothing threatening. One of them shifted his weight. None of them moved to stop him. "You want me to dig," he said slowly, testing the word like it belonged to a language he'd only read about in books. "I want you to work for your position," Zendaya said. "Big sisters don't come free. There's a whole apprenticeship." He knelt down, carefully, like he was worried about creasing the fabric of his trousers, and scooped a small, painfully polite amount of sand into the bucket. Zendaya watched him with the flat disappointment of a foreman inspecting substandard masonry. "That's not digging, that's decorating." She crouched beside him and shoved her own shovel into the sand with a decisive crunch, flipping a heap into his bucket in one motion. "Watch, you put your whole arm into it. You're not scared of a little dirt, are you?" "No," Jinsu said, too quickly, in the tone of someone who was, in fact, a little scared of dirt, having likely never been formally introduced to it before. Something about the seriousness of his face, the way he was concentrating on this ridiculous plastic bucket like it was a merger he needed to close, cracked something open in Zendaya's chest that she wasn't old enough to have a name for yet. She softened, just slightly, the way you soften around something small and stray that keeps following you home. "Okay, look," she said, quieter now, kneeling down properly beside him instead of standing over him like a supervisor. "You don't have to be scared here. Nobody's gratting you." She glanced back at the men in black suits who hadn't moved an inch, who seemed to exist purely as furniture with peripheral vision. "Do they always follow you like that?" "Always," Jinsu said. "Even to the bathroom, well, not inside, but outside the door." "That sounds exhausting." "It's for my protection." He said it like a memorized sentence, something repeated to him so many times it had worn smooth, all the meaning rubbed off the edges. Protection from what? Jinsu's small hands stilled over the bucket. For a second he looked like he might actually answer, like something real was about to surface behind those careful eyes. But then one of the guards' radios crackled softly, a burst of clipped Korean too low for Zendaya to catch, and the boy's whole posture snapped back into its practiced stillness, like a marionette whose strings had just been checked. Somewhere behind the hedge line, one of the men muttered something into his sleeve, low and urgent, something about getting back before anyone at the house noticed he was gone. Zendaya didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the tone adults used right before they were about to be in very big trouble. She filed that away, a small, unanswered itch in the back of her mind, and decided, for now, to let it sit. "Anyway," she said, forcing the moment back into daylight, picking the gold card back up off the sand where she'd set it down, turning it over in her fingers, studying the raised lettering, the little embossed emblem she couldn't quite place. "I'm not taking this. It's weird. You can't just hand people cards like it's a business card exchange." "Please," Jinsu said, and there it was again, that crack in the polish, the real boy underneath the suit. "I just want someone home when I get home." And that plain, unarmored sentence from a 7-year-old who talked like a boardroom memo was the thing that finally got her. "Fine," she sighed, the way a queen sighs when granting an audience she never wanted to grant. "You can be my assistant, probationary. If you're bad at it, I revoke your title." She stuck the card into the back pocket of her dungarees without really thinking about it, the way you pocket a shiny rock or a stray hair tie, a small object, nothing more, already forgotten in favor of more sand-related priorities. Now dig properly this time, whole arm. It was in the middle of watching her new probationary assistant attempt, valiantly and badly, to pack a wet sand brick, that Zendaya heard her mother's voice call her name from the blanket, and looked up to see Nia finally walking toward them, coffee cup abandoned, that particular tightness already gathering in her shoulders that meant she'd clocked the 3 men in black suits standing at the tree line like they were guarding a bank. Nia's eyes went first to her daughter, then to the small, immaculately dressed boy kneeling in the dirt beside her. Then, almost as an afterthought, the way your eye catches on something only after your brain has already started to worry, to the corner of gold poking out of Zendaya's back pocket. "Baby, what is that in your pocket?" Zendaya pulled it out without thinking, held it up for inspection like she was showing off a good grade. "Oh, this. Jinsu gave it to me. I'm his big sister now. It's official." Nia took the card, turned it over once. Read the raised name stamped along the bottom edge in quiet, expensive lettering. A name she recognized instantly, the way you recognize a storm cloud before the wind even changes. A name whispered in her old neighborhood the way people whisper things they hope never to meet in person. And every trace of warmth drained clean out of her face. If you're the kind of woman who's had to stand your ground for your child before, no matter who is standing on the other side of that ground, type love in the comments right now. Not because it's cute, because you know exactly what Nia is about to have to do, and you know she's not backing down. And if you enjoy stories about ruthless mafia bosses, forbidden romance, revenge, and power struggles, I've written original novels with even more twists than what you're watching right now. You can start reading today using the link in the description. Nia's hand didn't move for a full 3 seconds, the card sitting flat against her palm like it had weight it had no business having. And in that silence, the whole playground kept right on turning around her. Kids shrieking, chains creaking, somebody's radio 2 benches overplaying something with too much bass. Like the world hadn't noticed that hers had just tilted. "Mom," Zendaya's voice came from somewhere far away, even though she was standing right there in the sand-dusted knees and all. "Mom, you're doing the face." "What face?" "The face you did when the health inspector came early." Nia didn't answer that. She was too busy staring at the names stamped along the bottom of the card, running her thumb over the raised letters like she was hoping friction might change them into something else, something ordinary. Some rich kid's daddy who owned a chain of dry cleaners or a shipping company nobody had ever had reason to whisper about in hushed voices at church. But the letters didn't change. They never do. And she'd heard that name before, not from the news, not from a headline, but from the low, careful voice of a woman 2 booths down at the hair salon 3 years back, dropping it mid-sentence, and then immediately changing the subject like she'd said something she could get in trouble for just by saying it out loud. She looked up. The little boy Jinsu, Zendaya had called him, was still crouched in the sandbox, dutifully packing his bucket, utterly unbothered, like handing away his father's card was a completely reasonable transaction for a Tuesday afternoon. And behind him, 30 feet back under the shade of the plane trees, 3 men in black suits stood exactly where they'd been standing the whole time, not moving, not talking, just watching, waiting. For what, she didn't know. That was the part that scared her most. She didn't know what they were waiting for, and people who don't know what they're waiting for usually find out the hard way. "We need to go," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, the voice she used at the shop when the oven timer went off wrong and she needed everyone to move without panicking. "Right now, pack up." "Go, we just got here. Jinsu hasn't even finished his." Zendaya Renee. That was the name that got used maybe 4 times a year, and Zendaya's head snapped up at the sound of it like she'd been struck. "Get the blanket, now." They didn't run. Nia was very deliberate about that. You don't run in front of men like that. Running tells them something. Running invites the wrong kind of attention. But they didn't dawdle either, folding the quilt into something that barely resembled a coffee cup abandoned in the trash on the way past. Zendaya glancing back over her shoulder at Jinsu the whole way to the car like she was leaving a stray puppy behind at a shelter. It wasn't until they were 3 blocks from home, Zendaya's dungarees balled up in the wash along with a week's worth of towels, that Nia found the card again. Not in her own hand this time, but in the back pocket of the very jeans she was about to throw in the machine. The gold edge of it catching the kitchen light like it had been waiting there the whole ride home just to remind her it hadn't been a dream. She sat down at the kitchen table. Just sat, card in both hands, staring at it the way you stare at a positive pregnancy test you weren't planning for, or a diagnosis you weren't ready to hear. Her whole small, careful, hard-won life ran through her head in about 4 seconds flat. The lease on the shop she'd finally gotten approved after 18 months of no's. The little bit of savings she'd scraped into an account with her daughter's name on it. The quiet, unremarkable normalcy she had built brick by brick, specifically so nothing like this could ever touch them. "Zendaya," she called, and something in her tone brought her daughter into the kitchen at a dead sprint. What happened?" Nia held the card up between two fingers like it was something that might bite. "Do you have any idea whose name is on this medal?" Zendaya blinked at it. "Some rich guys. I don't know, Mom. I didn't run a background check. I was building a sandcastle." "This is not some rich guy." Nia's voice cracked slightly, and she hated that it cracked, hated that her hands weren't quite steady either. "This is a very, very dangerous man. The kind of man people don't say no to. The kind of man who has people disappeared for less than what you're holding right now." "He didn't kidnap me, Mom. Calm down. He paid me." Zendaya crossed her arms, chin lifted in that particular way she had when she believed she was being perfectly reasonable and the adults around her simply hadn't caught up. "It's a fair contract for my big sister services. I earned that." "You cannot earn a mafia boss's personal card, baby. That is not how contracts work. Big sister boot camp isn't free labor. If this man thinks we kidnapped his son, or stole from his son, or that we're holding on to this for some kind of leverage, we will not survive the week. Do you understand me? People like that don't wait for explanations." Nia was on her feet now, packing the small kitchen, the card still clutched tight enough to leave a mark in her palm, running through every version of how this could go, mailing it back anonymously. No, too risky. They could trace a postmark. Leaving it with a lawyer, she didn't have a lawyer. Walking into wherever that man's office was and handing it back herself in person, before anyone had time to draw the wrong conclusion about a single mother and her daughter in possession of something that valuable. And that was when the question landed, sharp and sudden, cutting clean through her own fear. If a man that dangerous, that guarded, kept 3 armed men on his 7-year-old son at all times, why had none of them stopped the boy from walking straight up to a stranger's child and handing away what was clearly something that mattered? She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure she wanted one. "I'm taking it back myself," she said finally, mostly to herself, already moving toward the hall closet for her good coat, the one she kept for court dates and church funerals, and now, apparently, for walking into the lion's den of Seoul's most feared syndicate boss. "Tomorrow, before he sends someone looking for it." "Mom, you don't even know where he..." "I know exactly where every dangerous man in this city keeps his office, baby." Nia's voice had gone flat and cold in a way Zendaya had heard maybe twice in her life. "I grew up 2 blocks from men like that. I know the address by heart. I just prayed I'd never have a reason to walk through the door." If you're the kind of woman who'd walk into a stranger's stronghold to protect what's hers, no hesitation, no permission needed, drop your answer below. Would you return that card the second the sun came up, or would you keep it close, just in case you needed it more than he did? Because Nia's about to find out there's no answer that keeps her fully safe, only the one that keeps her daughter that way. She hadn't walked through that address by heart in over a decade, but her feet still remembered the way. And by 6 the next evening, she was standing across the street from a building that didn't have a sign, didn't need one. The kind of place where the valet parking alone told you everything about who was allowed inside and who wasn't. Getting in wasn't the hard part. That was the thing nobody warned you about with places like this. The front door was practically a fortress, metal detectors dressed up as concierge desks, men in earpieces pretending to be doormen. But the back, the kitchen entrance, the loading dock where the catering trucks came through, that was a different world entirely. One Nia had spent 6 years learning inside and out back, when she was 23 and hustling shifts for an events company that catered exactly this kind of clientele. She still had Yoon-hee's number in her phone. Still remembered how to tie the black apron just right, how to keep her eyes down and her tray steady and become, for the length of an evening, invisible in exactly the way that got you past every checkpoint in the building. She borrowed the uniform. She borrowed the tray. And she walked straight through the kitchen doors of the private venue with a row of champagne flutes balanced like she'd never left the job, heart going so hard in her chest, she was half convinced the glasses would start rattling on their own. The lounge she found him in was the kind of room designed to make ordinary people feel like they'd wandered somewhere they didn't belong. Low gold light, dark wood, men in suits speaking in low voices at the edges of the room, while a handful of bodyguards stood along the walls like furniture nobody dared to sit on. And in the center of it, at a private table set apart from everyone else, sat the man whose name was stamped on the card, burning a hole in her coat pocket. He didn't look up right away. He was mid-sentence with someone across the table, voice low, and even the kind of calm that only comes from a man who has never once had to raise his voice to be obeyed. Sharp features. Dark hair combed back without a strand out of place. A faint scar along his jaw that caught the light when he turned his head, the only imperfection on an otherwise flawless, terrifying picture of control. Nia set the tray down on the nearest surface, not gently, and the sharp clink of glass against wood was enough to turn every head in the room. Two of the bodyguards moved before she'd even finished the motion, closing in on either side of her, and the nearest one spoke low and fast in Korean before switching, coldly, to English when he clocked her face. "You have 3 seconds to state your business before my men handle you." "My business," Nia said, and her voice did not shake, would not let itself shake, "is with him." Do Hyun finally looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief she almost missed it, something crossed his face that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite curiosity, something closer to a man recalculating a math problem he thought he'd already solved. "Stand down," he said quietly, and the guards peeled back like water around a stone, though they didn't go far. Nia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the card, and before anyone in that gilded, terrible room could stop her, she closed the distance and threw it, not handed it, threw it, so it hit him square in the chest before clattering onto the white tablecloth in front of him. The room went dead silent. Somewhere behind her, she heard one of the men at the edges of the room murmur something under his breath, low and disbelieving, something that, when she asked Yoonhee about it later, would translate roughly to "nobody has ever spoken to Chairman Kim and walked out alive." She didn't care. She was too far past caring to stop now. "Your son," she said, and every syllable came out sharp enough to cut, "walked into a public park without you, offered that to my 11-year-old daughter, and asked her to be his sister because he is so starved for a family that he thought he could purchase one with plastic. Do you have any idea what that does to a child? Do you have any idea what it looks like from the outside, watching a 7-year-old try to buy affection because nobody at home is giving him any for free?" Do Hyun's expression didn't move, not visibly, but something in his jaw tightened, just slightly, the kind of tightening that told her the words had landed even if his face refused to admit it. "You don't know anything about my household," he said, low and even. "I know your son ran from 3 armed guards to talk to a stranger in a sandbox. I know that's not something a happy kid does." She planted both hands flat on the table and leaned in, close enough that one of the guards took an involuntary step forward before Do Hyun raised 2 fingers, barely, and stopped him cold. "Keep your VIP card. Keep your money. You want to give that boy something worth having. Try showing up for him instead of handing him metal and calling it love." For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. The low murmur of business conversation at the far tables had died completely. Every eye in the lounge locked on the woman in a borrowed catering apron who had just said, out loud, in front of everyone, the thing that not one soul in that man's entire organization would have dared whisper. And then, quietly, almost too quietly for her to hear it, Do Hyun asked the one question she hadn't prepared for. "What did he say to your daughter? Exactly. His words." There was something underneath the question that didn't match the cold, unreadable mask on his face. Something that sounded almost like fear or grief or both. And Nia found herself pausing, thrown, wondering for the first time in this entire confrontation what exactly it was she'd walked into the middle of, and why a man who ran an empire built on violence would care so much, right now, in this room, about the precise wording of a lonely little boy's plea. She didn't get to answer, because that was the moment the doors at the far end of the lounge swung open, and one of Do Hyun's men crossed the floor at a pace too fast to be casual, leaning down to murmur something urgent in his ear, and Nia watched the temperature of the entire room drop as Do Hyun's eyes cut sharply toward her for the first time with something that looked, unmistakably, like calculation. "Chairman Kim," the man had said, loud enough this time for her to catch it even without the language. And whatever he said after that made Do Hyun rise slowly from his seat, buttoning his jacket with the terrible calm of a man who had just been handed a piece of information that changed everything about the woman standing in front of him. If you're loving the way an 11-year-old's mother just walked into a mafia boss's private lounge and told him the truth nobody else would dare say, hit that subscribe button right now. Because Chairman Kim just found out something about Nia Simps that's about to change the entire game, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Whatever information had just landed in his ear, Do Hyun didn't share it with her. Not yet. He only said quietly to the man who delivered it, confirm it. Discreetly. I want to know everything before I say another word to her. And then he turned back to Nia with a look that had shifted, just slightly, from cold calculation to something far more unreadable. You'll be hearing from me, was all he said, and then he was gone, trailed by his men, leaving her standing alone in that gilded lounge with her heart still hammering and absolutely no idea what she'd just set in motion. She heard from him 5 days later. Not a call, a car, sleek and black, parked outside the bakery at closing time, and a single folded note delivered by a driver who didn't say a word, just handed it over and waited for her to read it before he drove off. Saturday. The park. 2 o'clock. That was all it said. No apology, no explanation, just a man used to giving instructions and expecting them followed. Nia almost didn't go. She stood in her kitchen that whole week turning it over, the pride in her telling her to burn the note, the mother in her knowing that if there was even a small chance this could keep her daughter safe from whatever world that card belonged to, she couldn't afford not to show up. So Saturday came, and there she was again, quilt spread on the same patch of grass, watching Zendaya march toward the sandbox with the confidence of a girl reclaiming her territory. And there, 20 minutes later, was Kim Do Hyun, stepping out of his car in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, flanked by 2 guards instead of 3, walking toward the playground like a man walking into a hostile negotiation he had badly underprepared for. He'd expected, if he was honest with himself, to find the woman from the lounge again, sharp-tongued, unshaken, ready for round 2. What he had not expected was to be intercepted before he'd even made it past the wooden border of the sandbox by an 11-year-old girl in overalls, hands on her hips, blocking his path like a very small, very determined bouncer. You're late, Zendaya informed him. Do Hyun blinked. Nobody had said those 2 words to him in roughly a decade. I was not aware I had an appointment. You do now. Jinsu's been asking about you all week, and since you're clearly not going to fix that on your own, I'm putting you on the schedule. She reached down, picked up a small plastic shovel caked in dried mud, and held it out to him with the flat, businesslike expression of someone issuing a work order. Trench duty. We're expanding the moat. Do Hyun looked at the shovel, then at the girl. Then, briefly, over her shoulder at Nia, who was sitting on the quilt with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she would very much enjoy watching whatever happened next. I manage global territories, young lady, he said, with the particular dry patience of a man who ran boardrooms full of people twice this child's size and had never once had his authority questioned so directly. I do not shovel mud. Then your contract is terminated, Uncle Boss. Zendaya didn't even blink. She turned on her heel like the matter was closed, calling over her shoulder as she walked away. Jinsu, tell your dad he's fired. He doesn't get to see you today. From somewhere in the sandbox, a small, immaculately dressed 7-year-old froze mid-scoop, looking up at his father with an expression so openly, quietly hopeful, that it did something to Do Hyun's chest he wasn't entirely prepared for. The boy hadn't asked for anything, hadn't demanded, hadn't complained even once about a father who was more often a voice on a phone than a man in a room. He'd simply been waiting, the way children wait, patiently, for scraps of attention they've learned not to expect. Do Hyun took the shovel. He lowered himself down onto the sand, awkwardly, one knee at a time, in a $3,000 suit, while his 2 guards stood at a careful distance doing an extraordinary job of pretending they weren't watching their employer negotiate the terms of a sandbox trench with a 5th grader, and began, badly, to dig. Deeper, Zendaya instructed, arms crossed, supervising with the seriousness of a construction foreman. "That's not a trench, that's a paper cut." "I am attempting," Do Hyun said, with the strained dignity of a man trying very hard to hold onto some shred of authority, "to preserve the integrity of my suit." "Then you should have worn work clothes, Uncle Boss. Nobody told you to dress like you're going to a wedding." Across the blanket, Nia had given up entirely on hiding her amusement, one hand pressed over her mouth, shoulders shaking, watching the most feared man in the city fail spectacularly at basic sandbox physics under the withering supervision of an 11-year-old. "Look at the big, bad mobster," she called out, not even trying to keep the laughter out of her voice, getting outmaneuvered by a fifth grader. Do Hyun shot her a look, sharp, wounded, entirely without its usual menace, and something about the sheer novelty of being teased, openly, by a woman who clearly wasn't afraid of him, cracked the corner of his mouth into something that wasn't quite a smile but was dangerously close to one. It was in the middle of all this, Jin-soo finally laughing, actually laughing, a sound Do Hyun realized with a small, private ache he hadn't heard from his son in longer than he wanted to admit, that Nia's amusement caught on something else entirely. She watched Do Hyun's guards standing at that careful, respectful distance, watch the way their eyes never stopped scanning the tree line even now, even in the middle of a children's sandbox, checking exits, checking rooftops, checking a park bench like it might be hiding something. It was the same instinct she'd have expected from men protecting a president, not a businessman, not even a boss of an ordinary criminal outfit. Something about the intensity of it, the sheer, practiced paranoia of it, didn't sit right, and she found herself wondering, watching those men's eyes move, exactly what Do Hyun was so afraid might come walking through those trees. She didn't get long to sit with the question, because that was when one of the guards' phones buzzed, sharp and sudden in the quiet of the park, and Do Hyun, still kneeling in the sand, shovel in hand, dignity thoroughly abandoned, looked up at the man's face and watched it go from careful neutrality to something tight and urgent in the span of half a second. If you're loving the sight of a terrifying crime boss losing a shovel negotiation to a fifth grader, you already know exactly the kind of story I write, full length, twist after twist, and if you want more nights like this one, that's what you'll find waiting for you next. Whatever it was, it turned out to be nothing worth the guard's tight jaw. A supplier shipment delayed at one of Do Hyun's legitimate holdings, the kind of ordinary business hiccup that meant absolutely nothing to anyone but made his men jump like it was a siren. And Do Hyun waved him off with 2 fingers and went right back to badly reinforcing his trench. And that, more than anything else that had happened so far, was the moment Nia decided this man might actually be trying. That first Saturday became a second, and the second became a habit, and by the 4th week, nobody was pretending anymore that these visits were anything but expected. Jin-soo showed up now in play clothes instead of tailored jackets. Zendia had put her foot down about that in week 2, informing him flatly that nobody digs trenches in a blazer, and he'd taken to arriving a full 10 minutes early, tugging at his father's sleeve from the car door before the guards had even finished their perimeter check, because he refused to lose a single minute of sandbox time. He was different out there. Looser. He laughed now, actual real laughter, not the polite half-smile he gave at home when someone told a joke he didn't understand. He'd started calling Zendia Big Sister, without irony, without hesitation, the title fully earned and fully claimed. And there was, of course, the tax. "Sister Tax," Zendia announced one Saturday, holding out an open palm to Jin-soo the second he climbed out of the car, "is due. I accept snacks, allowance, or emotional support. Pick one." "I brought you a rice cake," Jin-soo said solemnly, producing one from his jacket pocket like it was tribute owed to a queen, "and I have been practicing my emotional support face." "Let's see it." He made a face, earnest, wide-eyed, trying so hard to look supportive that it came out slightly constipated, and Zendia doubled over laughing so hard she had to sit down in the sand, and Do Hyun, watching from the edge of the blanket, felt something in his chest loosen that had been wound tight for longer than he could remember. It was Nia who noticed, weeks in, that he'd started showing up not just on Saturdays. He'd taken to stopping by the bakery in the evenings, always after the last customer had gone, always with some excuse. He was in the neighborhood. He'd heard the cinnamon rolls were worth the detour. He needed to discuss logistics for the following weekend that could easily have been handled by text. She let him keep the excuses. She didn't need them to be true to enjoy the 10 minutes of quiet that came with a man sitting at her counter, tie loosened, saying almost nothing while she closed out the register. Tonight he was on his usual stool, a cinnamon roll steaming in front of him, and Nia was wiping down the counter with the kind of unhurried motion she only allowed herself once the shop was locked and the sign flipped to closed. "You know," she said, glancing up at him, "most men who run empires don't sit this still for 10 whole minutes without checking a phone." "Most men who run empires," he said, breaking off a piece of the roll with more care than the task required, "have never had a reason to." "Why does a dangerous man like you," she asked, half teasing, half genuinely curious, "look so peaceful eating a warm cinnamon roll?" He was quiet for a moment, turning the question over the way he turned over everything, slowly, deliberately, like a man who'd learned the hard way that careless words cost more than careful silence. "Because peace is something money couldn't buy me," he said finally, "until I walked into your shop." Nia stopped wiping the counter, set the rag down. "That's a big thing to say about cinnamon rolls." "It's not about the cinnamon rolls." He looked up at her then, and for the first time since she'd met him, since the lounge, since the sandbox, since every carefully controlled version of himself she'd encountered, something in his face went unguarded. "I haven't slept a full night in 6 years. Not since my wife. I run every meeting the same way I run security, assuming the worst version of every outcome, because assuming anything less got people I loved killed. I forgot, somewhere in there, what it felt like to just sit somewhere and not be waiting for something to go wrong. And here you're not waiting." "Here," he said, quiet, almost surprised at his own honesty, "I'm just eating a cinnamon roll." She didn't know what to do with the tenderness that rose up in her at that, didn't trust it, not fully, not with everything she knew about who he was and what his world could do to hers. But she reached for the towel again, mostly to give her hands something to do besides betray her. "Careful, Chairman," she said, forcing lightness back into her voice before it could get away from her. "People might think you actually have a heart." "I have been informed," he said, the ghost of a smile finally breaking through, "that I do not, in fact, know how to shovel sand correctly. So my reputation has already suffered enough this month." She laughed, really laughed, the kind that surprised her, and for one unguarded moment neither of them said anything at all, just sat there in the quiet of the closed shop with the smell of cinnamon and butter still warm in the air, and something passed between them that neither one was ready to name out loud. It was Nia who broke it, eventually, glancing down at the small gold band he still wore, faded slightly at the edges from years of wear, and the unanswered question rose up in her before she could stop it. Not why he still wore it. She understood grief well enough not to ask that. But what exactly had happened to the woman who'd once worn its matching half? Nobody had told her. Not Jinsu, not the guards, not the rumors she half remembered from her old neighborhood. Just the ring and the silence around it, and a man who flinched, almost imperceptibly, every time the topic of his son's mother came anywhere near the conversation. She didn't ask, not tonight, but she filed it away the same way she'd filed away the guard's paranoia in the sandbox weeks ago, a small locked door in the back of her mind that she suspected. Eventually, she'd have no choice but to open. Du Hyun finished the last of the cinnamon roll, wiped his hands with a care that felt almost ceremonial, and stood to leave. And it was in that quiet, ordinary motion, the two of them alone in a locked bakery at 9 at night, that his phone finally buzzed against the counter, and Nia watched his whole posture change in an instant, watched 6 weeks of softening armor snap back into place so fast it was like watching a door slam shut, and she knew, before he even looked up at her, that whatever was on that screen had just brought his other world crashing back into this one. The phone's glow lit his face for half a second before he silenced it and slid it face down into his jacket, and Nia watched the whole gesture like she was watching a man fold a letter he didn't want her to read. "Whoever that was," she said, "they can wait 10 more seconds." "They can't, actually." But he didn't move toward the door yet. He stood there in the middle of her shop, the smell of yeast and burnt sugar still hanging in the air from the day's last batch, and something in the way he looked at her, not at the phone, not at the door, at her, told her he was choosing to stay a beat longer than his own rules allowed. "Before I go, I need you to look at something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, thin, cream-colored, the kind of paper that cost more than it had any right to, and set it on the counter between them with the same ceremonial care he'd used on the empty cinnamon roll plate. Nia wiped her hands on her apron before she opened it, some old instinct telling her not to touch important paper with sugar on her fingers, and when she saw what was inside, her whole body went still. A deed. The building 2 doors down, the one with the broken awning, and the for lease sign that had been curling in the window since spring, the one she'd walked past every single day dreaming, quietly, privately, never out loud, of what a second oven and real seating might do for her. Her name was already on it, paid in full. "Do Hyun." Her voice came out low, careful, the way you talk when you're giving someone a chance to take something back before it becomes real. "What is this?" "It's yours." He said it simply, like it cost him nothing, which was, she understood in that moment, exactly the problem. No loan, no lien, free and clear. You've been talking about the second oven for a month, about needing more counter space, about the mixer that keeps giving out on you halfway through a batch. I'm tired of watching you white-knuckle your way through Tuesdays. You bought me a building. I bought you room to breathe. That is not yours to buy. She closed the folder harder than she meant to, the sound of it slapping shut louder in the quiet shop than it should have been. I didn't ask you for this. You shouldn't have to ask. He said it like it was obvious, like she was the one being unreasonable, and that, more than the deed itself, was what put the heat behind her next words. Do you know what this looks like? A man like you, handing a woman like me a building, no strings, no loan, no paper trail she has to earn her way out of. I have spent 11 years building something with my own 2 hands, so nobody could ever say I owed my name to a man. And you walk in here with a folder and think you're doing me a kindness. I am doing you a kindness. You're doing yourself a kindness. Her hands were shaking now, and she hated that they were shaking, hated that her voice had climbed somewhere she didn't want it to go, but it kept climbing anyway. This isn't protection, Do-hyun. This is a leash with better lighting. You want to know I'm taken care of so you don't have to worry about me the way you worry about everything else in your life, controlled, managed, accounted for. I am not a line item. I don't take handouts from mob bosses, Do-hyun. The words hit the shop like a dropped tray, and for a second neither of them moved. Somewhere in the back, near the storeroom doorway, Zendaya had gone still with a dish towel in her hand, pretending very badly to still be drying a mixing bowl she'd already dried twice, watching the 2 adults with the wide, careful eyes of a child cataloging every word for later. Do-hyun's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its softness, gone flat and cold in a way she hadn't heard since the lounge, since the night she'd thrown his son's card at his chest in front of half his organization. It's not a handout, it's protection for the woman I care about. I don't need your protection, I need you to respect me. She was around the counter now, close enough to see the muscle working in his jaw, close enough that neither of them was performing for anyone but each other. Respect means you ask. Respect means you see me struggling with a mixer and you say, "Do you want help?" Not you decide I'm struggling and hand me a solution wrapped up like I don't get a vote in my own life. I have watched women in your world disappear into men like you, dressed well, protected, silenced. I will not be one of them. I am nothing like the men who did that to you. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the word nothing, and it was the first unguarded thing he'd said all night. I watch you carry this whole shop, this whole life, on your back every single day, and all I want is for one thing to stop being hard for you. Then ask me what's hard, Do-hyun. Don't solve it for me. There's a difference between loving someone and managing them, and I need you to know which one you're doing, because I have spent my whole life clawing away from men who couldn't tell those 2 things apart. He didn't answer right away, and in the silence that followed, Nia found herself staring at the fatting gold band on his finger, the question she'd been carrying for weeks rising up again, uninvited. What exactly had he done, all those years ago, when the woman who wore its match had needed something from him, and had he handed her a deed too, instead of asking what she actually needed. He picked the folder back up off the counter, slow, deliberate, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'll hold on to it then, until you're ready to hear it as what it actually is. Don't hold your breath." He was almost at the door when his phone buzzed again, twice this time, urgent, insistent, and this time he didn't silence it. He looked down at the screen, and Nia watched every trace of the man who just fought with her about pride and protection vanish, replaced by something she'd only seen once before. In the lounge, the night his men had come to whisper something in his ear that changed the temperature of an entire room. "I have to go," he said, already moving, already gone in every way that mattered before he'd even reached the door. "Lock up behind me. Don't open for anyone tonight. Anyone, Nia, I mean it." And then he was out into the dark, the bell over the door still swinging, and Nia stood alone in her own shop with a folder-shaped absence on the counter, and a fear she couldn't name yet climbing slow and cold up the back of her neck. Do-hyun was wrong to cut them off to protect them, agree or disagree. Say it with your chest in the comments, because after tonight, silence is the one thing Nia can't afford to give him. The knock came exactly when Nia had been dreading it, not on the shop's front door, but 3 days later, in broad Saturday daylight, at the one place she'd let her guard all the way down. The park was full that afternoon, strollers and folding chairs, and the lazy hum of a neighborhood that had no idea what it was standing in the middle of. Jinsu had arrived early again, tugging Do-hyun toward the sandbox before his guards had even finished their perimeter check. And for 20 minutes it had been ordinary, trench duty, sister tax, a rice cake solemnly presented as tribute. Do-hyun sat on the low concrete edge of the sandbox in a soft gray sweater instead of a suit, watching his son laugh at something Zendaya said, and Nia had let herself think, just for a moment, that maybe this was what safe was supposed to feel like. She didn't see the man by the tree line until his hand moved. It happened fast the way real danger always does, not the slow-motion drama of a movie, but a blur, a wrongness, a sound like the world tearing. One of Do-hyun's guards shouted something in Korean that needed no translation, and Do-hyun was on his feet before the first shot cracked across the playground, his whole body changing shape in the space of a breath, the soft-sweatered father gone, replaced by something else entirely, something coiled, fast, terrible. "Zendaya, grab Jinsu and get behind the wall." Nia didn't remember deciding to move. Her body simply went, the way a mother's body always goes, faster than thought, faster than fear. She had Zendaya by the wrist and Jinsu hauled against her hip in the same motion, dragging both children the 6 feet toward the low concrete planter wall that bordered the garden beds, screaming at Zendaya to get down, stay down, while gravel kicked up in sharp little puffs where bullets found the ground instead of flesh. Behind the wall, her back pressed to the cold concrete, Nia pulled both children into her chest and became, for those endless seconds, nothing but a body between them and the world. She felt Zendaya shaking against her ribs, felt Jinsu go rigid and silent in a way that broke something in her, a 7-year-old who knew, with terrible fluency, exactly what this sound meant, who had perhaps always known this day might come. Screams rose up from the rest of the park, parents scattering with children under their arms, the ordinary Saturday shattering into chaos in every direction. "You brought your war to my daughter's playground." Nia's voice tore out of her without permission, not quite a scream, something rower than that, aimed at no one and everyone, at the whole rotten machinery that had followed a good man's kindness straight into her life. Above the wall, through the gap where the concrete met the hedge, she caught pieces of it, Do-hyun moving in a way that made her stomach drop, not clumsy, not desperate, but precise, economical, a man returning to a language he'd hoped never to speak again in front of his son. One guard went down near the swings, and Do-hyun didn't so much as flinch, didn't slow, just kept closing the distance on the man who'd fired first, a man Nia would later learn was called Diho, sent by a rival house that had smelled weakness the moment its scouts reported a sandbox, a bakery, a soft gray sweater on a man who used to wear armor to breakfast. It was over faster than it had begun. That was the part that would haunt her later, replaying it in the dark. How quickly quiet returned. How the birds started up again in the trees like nothing at all had happened. How the only proof it had been real was the ringing in her ears, and the way Jin-soo's small hand had fisted so hard into her shirt that it left marks. Do-hyun stood over D-ho in the sudden hush, chest heaving, and when he spoke his voice came out low and flat and more frightening than any of the gunfire had been. "If any of them bleed, D-ho, I will wipe your entire bloodline off the map." He said it the way another man might state the weather, and that stillness was worse than shouting could ever have been. It was in the middle of that terrible calm, watching Do-hyun's hands that had moments ago calmly broken bread with her over a cinnamon roll, that the question rose up in Nia's chest and lodged there, unanswered and unwelcome. How many times had he done this before, exactly this, with this same unshaken precision? And what did it mean that some part of her, holding two shaking children behind a garden wall, was almost grateful for it? Sirens were already threading toward them in the distance, and Do-hyun's remaining guards were moving fast now, pulling bodies and evidence and consequence into the kind of order that only people who'd cleaned up violence before knew how to create in under 90 seconds. Do-hyun crossed the gravel toward the planter wall and dropped to his knees in front of it, and for one long moment he didn't reach for Jin-soo at all. He looked first at Nia, at the way she still hadn't loosened her grip on either child, at the blood-drained white of her knuckles against the concrete, and something passed over his face that looked almost like shame. "Are you hit?" His voice had dropped to something raw, something that belonged only to her. "Nia, look at me. Are either of you hit?" She shook her head, couldn't yet make words, and it was Zendaya who finally spoke first, small and shaking and fierce all at once, lifting her face from Nia's shoulder to look Do-hyun dead in the eye. "You said you had one job," she said. "Keep the company safe. You didn't say anything about keeping us safe, too." Do-hyun didn't answer. He couldn't, because somewhere behind them, one of his guards was murmuring urgently into a phone, and the two words Nia caught before Do-hyun's face went ash-gray were words that made the whole afternoon's terror feel like only the beginning. "She's awake." Every mother who's ever put her body between her child and the worst of the world. You already know there's no version of this story where Nia backs down now. If tonight's chapter had your heart in your throat, that same fire is exactly what's waiting for you in stories that make you feel something. 2 full novels of love, loss, and hope that will not let you go. It's the founding member edition, discounted for a limited time, free audiobook included, future books already yours. Grab your copy at the link below before the price goes back up, because one story will break your heart, and the other will heal it right back. "She's awake" turned out not to be the words that broke Nia. It was the silence that came after them, the way Do-hyun's guard lowered the phone, met his employer's eyes, and said nothing further at all, and Do-hyun rose from his knees in front of the planter wall like a man being pulled backward into a life he'd spent 6 weeks pretending he could set down. He didn't explain. That was the thing Nia would replay most, in the weeks that followed, not the gunfire, not the blood on the gravel, but the fact that a man who had sat at her counter and told her peace was something money couldn't buy simply straightened his jacket, said something low and urgent to his men in Korean, and left without another word to her. Jin-soo pulled along in his wake like a boy being returned to a box he'd only briefly been allowed out of. The calls stopped first. Then the evening stops at the bakery, the tie loosened at her counter, the 10 quiet minutes she hadn't known she'd started building her whole week around until they were gone. The Saturdays went next. No note this time, no black car idling outside the shop, just an absence where a habit used to be, and Zendaya standing at the window on the first missed Saturday in her overalls, waiting, watching the street with the particular patience of a child who hasn't yet learned that grown men sometimes disappear on purpose. Nia heard, eventually, through the kind of channels that always seemed to reach her whether she wanted them to or not, that Do-hyun had pulled his son out of the small private school he'd only just started attending like a normal child. That the compound gates were running triple shifts now, that Jin-soo hadn't been seen outside those walls in 3 weeks. She heard it the way you hear about someone else's grief, secondhand, softened, and it still landed like a stone in her chest every time. She didn't chase him. She'd promised herself a long time ago, After the last man who taught her what silence from someone you loved actually cost, that she would never again spend her pride begging a closed door to open. So she folded her hurt the way she folded everything else. Small, tight, tucked into the corner of a day too busy to examine it closely. And she told herself this was probably for the best anyway, that a woman with a daughter to raise had no business hopping for a future with a man whose enemies shot at playgrounds. It was harder to hide from Zendaya than from herself. "You're doing the quiet thing," Zendaya said one evening, perched on the kitchen counter while Nia scrubbed a mixing bowl that had already been clean for a full minute. "The thing where you don't talk about something so it looks like it doesn't hurt." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Jinsu's dad has a phone, Mom. He has, like, 40 phones probably. He's not busy. He's scared." Zendaya said it with the flat, devastating clarity that only an 11-year-old could manage, cutting straight past every polite fiction the adults in her life had built to protect themselves. "I am keeping them safe by staying away from them. That's basically what he told the guard on the phone that day. I heard him say it, right before they put us in the car. He thinks not seeing us is the same thing as protecting us." "Maybe he's right, baby." "He's not right." Zendaya hopped down off the counter with the sudden decisiveness of a girl who had already made up her mind about something and was simply informing the room. "You're not keeping us safe, Dad, you're just hiding because you're scared. That's not the same thing, and somebody needs to tell him that." "Zendaya," Nia set the bowl down, dried her hands, tried to find the right tone for a conversation she hadn't braced for. "This isn't a sandbox negotiation. This is a grown man's decision, and it's his to make. Jinsu doesn't get to make decisions either, and he's the one stuck behind those gates." There was something fierce rising in her daughter's face now, something that reminded Nia so sharply of herself at that age it nearly took her breath. "He's my little brother, Mom. I earned that. Sister tax was paid in full. I don't just quit because his dad got scared." Nia didn't have an answer for that, didn't trust herself to have one, not with grief sitting so close under her own ribs. And she watched Zendaya disappear down the hallway with the particular stomp of a child plotting something, and told herself it was nothing, told herself an 11-year-old had no way into a compound with armed guards and iron gates, and went back to a bowl that had needed no more scrubbing for 10 minutes now. She was wrong about the nothing. It was 3 days later that Zendaya appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a single sheet of paper, folded once, a small triumphant smile on her face that Nia recognized instantly as trouble. "What is that?" "A permission slip." Zendaya held it up like evidence in a trial only she understood the terms of. "For a school project, on family businesses in the community. I need to interview a local business owner about supply chains, and I already picked mine." "Zendaya," Nia felt something cold and warm move through her chest at the exact same time, dread and hope tangled together so tightly she couldn't tell which one was winning. "What did you do?" "Lock the gates, Mom." Zendaya's grin widened, sharp and proud, every bit her mother's daughter. "But he forgot I know how corporate mail works. I sent it to the company address on the VIP card. Attention, Chairman Kim Do-hyun." She set the paper on the counter with the flat, business-like satisfaction of someone closing a deal. "He has to answer official correspondence. It's the law of business. He taught me that himself. Trench duty made me his employee, remember? Employees get meetings." Nia stared down at the paper, at her daughter's careful handwriting, at a plan so audacious and so completely, achingly hopeful that she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And somewhere underneath both feelings sat the one she hadn't let herself feel in 3 weeks, the smallest, most stubborn flicker of it. Hope. Comment your city and country so we can see where our amazing story family is watching from today. Because if Zendaya's not giving up on that gilded cage, neither should you. That hope had not yet had time to prove itself wrong when, 3 floors up in a glass-walled conference room that smelled of cedar and expensive tension, Do-hyun sat at the head of a long black table, listening to men twice his age argue about territory lines he'd stopped caring about weeks ago without quite admitting it to himself. The council meeting had been running for 40 minutes, the usual business, supply routes, a rival house's overtures toward peace that nobody quite trusted, Security protocols tightened in the wake of the playground attack that still made the muscle in his jaw twitch every time it was mentioned. He answered when spoken to. He signed where his signature was required. But some part of him had been elsewhere for 3 weeks straight now, in a bakery that smelled like cinnamon, in a sandbox with a shovel he'd never mastered, and no amount of boardroom discipline had managed to fully drag him back. It was his head of security who broke protocol first, leaning down at his shoulder mid-sentence from the finance director, murmuring something so quietly that half the table didn't catch it at all. "Chairman, an urgent security breach arrived at the front gate." A pause, the man's composure cracking at the edges in a way Do Hyun had rarely seen from him. "It's written in purple crayon." The room didn't stop talking, not right away, but Do Hyun's whole body went still in the particular way it only did when something genuinely unexpected crossed his desk. Not danger. He could smell danger the way other men smelled rain coming, but this was something else entirely. Something that made no sense sitting inside a building built to withstand actual sieges. "Bring it," he said, and the finance director's sentence trailed off into confused silence as every man at that table watched their chairman set aside a shipment manifest to receive. With the same solemn formality his security team gave classified intelligence, a single folded piece of construction paper. He opened it slowly, and for one long moment, Kim Do Hyun, a man who had once negotiated a hostile territory handover without blinking, who had watched Deho's men open fire on a public park and neutralize the threat without his pulse so much as stuttering, simply stared, because there, in looping, determined purple crayon, underlined twice for emphasis, was a letter from an 11-year-old girl. "Dear Chairman Kim, this is an official complaint from your son's big sister department. You have been avoiding us for 3 weeks. I know you think hiding is the same as protecting, but it's not. It's just hiding, and Jin-soo cries about it even though he thinks nobody hears him through the wall. Adults always say they're making hard choices for kids' own good, but usually they're just scared and calling it a plan. I read that in a book. If you're too scared of camera jerks and bad guys, come to our house for pancakes. Nobody can find you at our kitchen table, and my mom makes the good syrup, not the fake kind. You are hereby ordered to respond within three business days, or I am revoking your VIP status as Uncle Boss. Permanently, no appeals. Sincerely, Zendia Renee, Big Sister, Sandbox Division." He read it twice. Nobody at the table said a word. 12 of the most dangerous men in the city sitting in absolute silence, watching their chairman's face do something none of them had ever witnessed in a boardroom before, soften, completely, unguardedly, the way frost gives way on glass when the sun finally clears the tree line. He laughed, not the careful, measured half-smile he allowed himself in negotiations, but something real, something that came from low in his chest and startled even him. And it was in the middle of that laugh, sudden, unbidden, 3 weeks of grief cracking open all at once, that the unanswered question rose up hard in his chest. What exactly had he been protecting his son from, these past 3 weeks, if not simply the one thing that had ever made the boy happy? Because that was the truth of it, wasn't it? He'd told himself distance was armor, that gates and guards and silence were love in its most responsible form, the same lie he'd been telling himself for 6 years since his wife. The same careful architecture of control that had kept Jin-soo fed and clothed and utterly, quietly starving the entire time. He had looked at a playground shooting and concluded the answer was less life, less risk, less joy, when the truth, staring back at him now in purple crayon, was that a boy who cried through walls he thought no one could hear was not a boy being protected. He was a boy being lost, slowly, the exact same way his father had been losing himself for 6 long years, one locked gate at a time. The head of security cleared his throat, uncertain whether to look relieved or alarmed by his employer's sudden shift in mood. "Chairman, shall I have security draft a formal response, or—" "No." Do Hyun folded the letter with the same ceremonial care he'd used on the deed, on the cinnamon roll, on every fragile, unfamiliar piece of tenderness that had wandered into his life these past 2 months, and slid it into his breast pocket, over his heart, where it sat next to nothing at all, because for the first time in 6 years, he realized he wasn't carrying his phone in that pocket. He'd left it on the table. He stood, buttoned his jacket, looked down the length of that long black table at 11 men who had followed him through every calculated, careful decision he'd ever made, and delivered the only order that had ever felt in that room, like it belonged to the man underneath the chairman instead of the other way around. "Gentlemen, the meeting is adjourned." He was already moving toward the door, already shrugging off 6 years of armor with every step already, for the first time since his wife's funeral, choosing something other than fear. An 11-year-old has issued an executive order. Nobody stopped him. Nobody dared. And as the glass doors swung shut behind their chairman, a man half the room had never once seen smile, walking out mid-council to answer a summons written in crayon. The finance director turned slowly to the head of security and asked the question every man at that table was suddenly, quietly wondering. Where exactly is he going? The head of security looked down at his own phone, at the tracking ping already lighting up on the chairman's private vehicle, already pulling out of the compound gates for the first time in 3 weeks, heading somewhere that had never once, in 6 years of guarding this man's life, appeared on any of their approved security routes. "Pancakes," he said. "He's going for pancakes." Pancakes turned out to be the least of it, because when the black car actually pulled up outside her building, no security detail trailing behind it, no second car idling at the curb the way there always was, Nia felt her whole chest go tight with a hope she still didn't quite trust. She was standing at the stove when the knock came, the kind of ordinary knuckles-on-wood knock she'd never once associated with Kim Do-hyun, who usually arrived the way weather arrived, announced by everyone around him before he ever appeared himself. Zendaya beat her to the door, yanked it open before Nia could even wipe her hands on her apron, and there he was, standing on the cracked welcome mat in the soft gray sweater from the park, hands empty, face doing something she'd never seen it do before, uncertain. "No bodyguards?" Zendaya asked, peering past him at the empty street like she expected the men in black suits to materialize out of thin air the way they usually did. "No suits." "Just me," Do-hyun said, and something about the way he said it, plain, unarmored, a man handing over the only currency he had left, made Nia set the spatula down before she dropped it. He stepped inside like a man crossing a border he'd spent years convinced he didn't have a passport for, taking in the small kitchen with its mismatched chairs, the crayon drawings taped crooked to the fridge, the smell of syrup already warming on the back burner because some stubborn, hopeful part of Nia had started it the moment Zendaya's letter went out, just in case. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked. And Nia, watching him look, understood with a small ache that he wasn't seeing a modest apartment at all. He was seeing something he'd been circling for 6 years without letting himself land. "I spent my life building walls, Nia." His voice came out lower than usual, stripped of every boardroom edge she'd grown used to. "Compounds, security perimeters, silence, when silence felt safer than being known. I told myself I was protecting the people I loved by keeping them behind those walls, and all I actually did was keep myself locked inside them too." He looked down at Zendaya, still hovering protectively at Nia's side, arms crossed in the exact posture of a girl guarding her territory. "Your daughter sent me a letter I didn't deserve and a truth I needed. I don't want to build another wall. Let me help you build a home instead." Nia didn't answer right away. 3 weeks of grief didn't dissolve on command, not even for a man standing in her kitchen with his hands empty and his heart, for once, not hidden behind either. She thought of the deed she'd thrown pride at, thought of the silence that had followed a playground shooting like a door slamming shut, thought of every reason a woman her age, who had lived enough life to know better, should keep her guard exactly where it was. But she thought, too, of 10 quiet minutes at her counter, of a man who ate cinnamon rolls like they were the first piece he'd tasted in years, of the particular way his voice had cracked over "I have to go" when what he'd really meant was "I'm terrified of losing this." "You don't get to disappear on us again," she said finally, and it wasn't quite forgiveness yet, not the whole of it, but it was a door left open where a week ago there had been none. Not because you're scared, not because it's easier, not for any reason at all. If this is real, Do-hyun, it doesn't get to have an off switch every time your other world gets loud. It won't, he said, and the way he said it, steady, certain, a promise built on the same bone-deep discipline that had once made him terrifying, was the thing that finally cracked her open. I am done choosing fear over you, over both of you. It was somewhere in the middle of that, Nia crossing the small kitchen toward him, the careful distance between them finally closing. That Jinsu appeared in the doorway behind his father, having slipped in quiet as ever, watching the whole scene with the same solemn attention he brought to trench duty and rice cake tribute and every serious matter of his short, careful life. He reached into his jacket, a smaller jacket now, soft cotton instead of tailored wool, one of the concessions Zendaya had wrung out of him weeks ago, and pulled out the gold VIP card, the same one he'd handed a stranger in a sandbox what felt like a lifetime ago. He walked past both adults without a word, climbed onto the step stool by the counter, and pulled open the cluttered kitchen junk drawer. The one crammed with rubber bands and expired coupons and a broken flashlight nobody had ever thrown away, and dropped the card in among all of it, closing the drawer with the quiet finality of a boy filing away a chapter of his life he no longer needed. I don't need the VIP card anymore, Dad. He said it simply, the way he'd once said I need a mom in that same flat, rehearsed cadence, except this time there was nothing rehearsed in it at all. Nobody charges me here. Zendaya, arms still crossed, watched her little brother's ceremony with the fierce, proud supervision of a foreman signing off on a job well done. And something about the sight of it, her daughter's chin lifted, Jinsu's small shoulders finally loose, Do-hyun's hand finding its way carefully, hopefully, to the small of her back, undid the last of whatever wall Nia had been holding onto too. There would be more to work out, she knew. There always was, with a man whose other world had a way of kicking doors down when you least expected it, with an 11-year-old already scheming her next negotiation, with a 7-year-old who still sometimes flinched at loud sounds. But standing in her small kitchen with syrup warming on the stove and a gold card buried under rubber bands where it belonged, Nia let herself believe, for the first time in 6 weeks, that whatever came next, they'd be building it together. If this story proved that family is built by love and not money, smash that like button right now. And if you want the 2 full novels that started this journey, grab stories that make you feel something at the discounted founding member price using the link below. Every future chapter, every future book, comes free the moment you're in. Don't miss your seat at this table.